Hello, my name is Arthur, and in the last video we had given a little explosion enemy to our animation to our enemy character, and I've moved some things around. I've taken all of the stuff that I put in take damage that was a consequence of health dropping to or below zero. I've put into the function called die and just made the function call there to properly separate the functions. Otherwise, the way that it was take damage would be take damage and die and do a couple other things. But this is function take damage. So when health is zero, it will now do those things in a proper function rather than up here. So now we'll get started on the player and add in his die animation. So let's look at him in 2D. I figure his animation will work as an animated sprite. So let's give him an animated sprite. We'll put that in. Let's get this out of the way. That's wrong. He's just a folder full of images. So we'll load up those images. Now, he's backwards because our original sprite was backwards. So we're just carrying on with the same mistake. And what we did to correct that was go scale -1 to flip him around this way. Then in the script, in order to have him flip around in the script, we would need to get into the player. That was flip animation. So it would be right here. When we flip the other sprite, we should flip the animated sprite. Let's give this a proper name first though. Let's call it die. So here we would flip die. Dot set flip H with the value of backwards. So now that animation will flip around with the player. So let's just toggle on and off to see how it sits. It sits a little bit different than the other sprite, but it's such a minor difference that it's not worth even considering. So let's look at the animation itself and see what we get out of that. I suppose we could zoom in. We don't need to see that panel. So we'll just start it to playing. It's looping, so it will play over and over again. That's pretty slow. Let's increase that a bunch. Let's put it up to 15. That's about right. So he just basically falls apart. So we'll call that good. We'll turn off playing. Set this back to 0. And we'll make an animation finished function. So we'll connect that to player on die animation finished. And we'll create the die function. So function die. It'll do the same things as in the enemy. So collision shape, set deferred. Set deferred. What's going on there? What's our warning? I'm not sure why it's doing that. Went right to a warning. It doesn't want to give me the command. Set deferred, disabled. True. Dollar sign sprite dot visible equals false. Dollar sign die dot visible equals true, which we need to set this to not being visible and this to being visible. Then dollar sign die dot play. Now up top here I've given a variable alive and set it to true. Inside a function process delta, I've nested the entire process under the condition that the player is alive. And to do that, I just typed if alive and then highlighted everything and pressed tab. And that nests it inside of the condition of being alive. So now if he's not alive, nothing can happen in physics process. He basically stops. So the last part of die, or the first part of die, becomes alive equals false. So now he's going to die. The other thing we need to do here is game manager dot lives minus equals 1. Then on die animation finished, we would be dollar sign die dot stop, because we need to stop the animation. Dollar sign die dot set frame zero, and if game manager dot lives equals 0, queue free. And when we have more lives, we'll be revisiting this and make a spawn so that the player can spawn instead of just the game ending. Because so far we've been messing around with the player only having one life and simply dying. So we're at 8 minutes. That gives us a little bit of time to mention that in Fire Enemy, it may become necessary to also give this variable alive, because we don't want to create sort of loopholes. And what would be an example of a loophole is, say the player killed an enemy and then could run around in the place that the enemy was and collect points for the duration of his die animation, or for a little spell after the enemy had died. That would be a loophole that could potentially develop. That sometimes older games used to have that type of a loophole. So we would stop something like that by using the same trick as was used in the player. Create a variable called alive, and then make physics process dependent on being alive. Something like on damage zone body entered. This happens outside of the path of the script. Like, the script has a path of its own, and then damage zone body entered. It happens as the result of something external. So this happens external to the script. So it's kind of like a signal, right? Which is how it gets set up. It's a signal. So when this happens, it sort of breaks out of what it was doing, comes here, then goes back to what it was doing. So because we're going body, give damage, at this point, we might want to be making that dependent on the enemy being alive still, because we haven't disabled. The only thing we've disabled is his collision shape. So his ability to have a damage zone still exists. That still exists. The rays still exist and have the potential for those kinds of little loopholes. So the way around those loopholes is to either disable everything or to make it dependent on a condition of him being alive, which can be a little bit easier than going through and disabling everything that isn't a physical thing. Like when a player collides into that, it isn't anything in his script. That's in the physics engine. But damage zone and ray 1 and ray 2, these are entirely contained within the script and can be made dependent on the condition that the enemy unit is still alive. So if there's any issues where strange things happen as a result of not disabling everything or making that condition, the first thing to look at for correcting the loophole would be to impose the condition that the enemy is alive in certain places to stop certain things from being able to happen once he's died. So that's kind of a lengthy explanation. I hope that's clear. In the case of the player, it's basically by bedding, nesting physics process under that condition. When the animation is playing, he's not registering as alive, so I can't move the animation around and make him jump around on the board. Then, like, if game manager lives does not equal 0, this will have an else. We'll just put pass and a comment, spawn player. And spawn player will reset the player, and we'll get around to that because some demonstrations have you queue free the player and then instance a new player, but that's not how I go about it. I do it differently than that. So we'll get back to that later. Let's see how much time I've blown on that. Okay, we only have enough time to check out and see if the function is working for the player unit. So we'll just let the enemy kill him. Things didn't work out. I have a good idea why. Let's see. At function take damage, we didn't make the function call. So instead of queue free, we have to put in the function call for die. So now that should work. Let's play. And yeah, in the next video, I'm not sure where I'm gonna go. This is probably the last video in the enemy and a point for me to make my introduction to part 3 sort of video, and then we'll move on from there. So I hope that was useful, and take care.